So, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about how American diplomacy or interactions with other parts of the world change at the turn of the century. We've already talked about a couple of different parts of the world. We've talked specifically about the Spanish American War, and that was a huge example in Cuba and in the Philippines about how American diplomacy underwent significant shifts. Well, we want to talk about other parts of the world. What else is going on? And we're going to spend a few minutes going over some of the basics and talk in much more detail in class about some of the examples that we're going to have here in this lesson. So this kind of connects with some of the things we've been talking about already. When we talked about the Philippines and the Spanish-American War, we are really talking about a gateway into Asia. And a big part of American diplomacy during the turn of the century is going to be about competing for spheres of influence in Asia. So let's get some of the vocabulary down. Sphere of influence is an area where a foreign nation controls economic development. The United States and other countries, European countries, recognized that Asia, China in particular, had huge potential as an economic marketplace and also as a place to engage in trading to get natural resources. And so here's your sphere. If a country can come in and assert control over a region or have influence over a region, then that would be beneficial to the home nation. And this is what the United States was trying to do when they engaged in the Spanish-American War with the Philippines. They wanted to basically create, as we've talked about, a gateway into Asia. Now, there are people in the United States who recognize that there's a potential for a problem here. And so let's talk a little bit about that. In 1899, the Secretary of State of John Hay convinces other countries to support what he calls an open door policy. And that's because all the competition in China amongst not only the United States but other European countries, colonial powers, really made the United States nervous. This is a time period where European countries are really starting to develop tensions with one another, in part because of competition over colonial territory. And if we can have this open door policy in which all countries are allowed to trade with China, then John Hay thinks that this is going to be something that will really ease tensions and maybe prevent conflict down the road. So that was his big idea, and he tried to promote this idea to other countries and to people in China as well. But of course, the one group of people we do really need to consider above all others are the Chinese. And a lot of Chinese don't want this foreign control. They don't feel as though they should be under the heavy influence of colonial powers. And so when Western nations come in and try to set up shop and set up businesses and purchase land, many Chinese are going to be very frustrated with this, and they're actually going to organize a revolt against the foreigners called the Boxer Rebellion. Eventually, an international force, and the United States is going to participate in this, is going to organize and put down this rebellion to protect these business interests, which shows you how important these colonial powers feel China is, that they're willing to work together to squash this rebellion. But it also shows you the aggressive nature of these colonial powers, and the fact that they're not willing to let these groups fight for independence. So there really is seeds of conflict which are growing here, and a lot of resentment towards foreign control. So as the situation in China unfolds and America's relationship with that part of the world develops, we have a major transition. Teddy Roosevelt becomes president, and there may be things we already know about Roosevelt. We've talked about him and the role he played in the Spanish-American War as a member of the Rough Riders. He was the vice president of the United States and became a popular choice for vice president because of his status as a war hero. And he becomes president when William McKinley is assassinated by an anarchist, or someone who believes that there should be no government or no rules. So McKinley's assassinated, and all of a sudden, Theodore Roosevelt becomes the youngest president in American history, and he is going to try and take the country in a new direction when it comes to foreign policy. So Teddy Roosevelt's motto was to speak softly and carry a big stick. And we're going to be talking a lot about this and what it really means. And here we have a picture of Theodore Roosevelt, and you see he's walking on the Caribbean Sea, and behind him he's towing, if you will, in his hand, a naval fleet and carrying a big stick. And the message here is pretty straightforward: is that he is going to be someone who is not afraid to use military force. He may say the right things at times, but he's going to make sure that American muscles get flexed. And in particular, and this cartoon points out, the Caribbean, Latin America, and South America are going to be big areas where Theodore Roosevelt turns his attention, in addition to the Pacific and Asia, as we've already been talking about. In Asia, Theodore Roosevelt actually supports the open door policy. And one of his interesting accomplishments as president was to negotiate a peace treaty between Russia and Japan during the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. He wants there to be stability in this part of the world. He doesn't want there to be conflict. He thinks it's bad for American interests. So he invites both of these countries to a negotiating table, of all places, in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and he helps them iron out a peace agreement. And Roosevelt ends up winning a Nobel Peace Prize for this, which is interesting because oftentimes he's seen as someone who certainly wasn't afraid to use the military when it came to foreign policy. But making sure we're taking a close look at what's happening within the areas closer to the United States, we need to talk about a really, really important concept called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So for this, we actually need to think all the way back to 1823, something you may have studied in your previous U.S. history course, when President Monroe at the time made a statement where he said that European countries should no longer colonize the Western Hemisphere or interfere with independent nations in the West. In other words, European countries should not have colonies anywhere on the half of the world that the United States is in. So that was really what his foreign policy was. President Roosevelt added what he called a corollary, or what others ended up calling a corollary, in 1904, where he basically made the statement that not only is the Western Hemisphere something that Europeans should stay out of, but the United States would intervene in Latin American affairs in the Western Hemisphere whenever necessary to maintain economic and political stability. So where Monroe says European nations aren't going to be getting involved on our half of the world, Roosevelt is basically saying we're in charge of our half of the world and we're going to do what we want in order to make sure that our interests are protected. So he takes Monroe's doctrine quite a bit further. There are numerous examples of the Roosevelt corollary in action. One of the biggest is in Panama, which we're going to talk about in pretty significant detail in class, with the Panama Canal. In 1905, Marines are sent to the Dominican Republic to force them to pay debts to European countries, because Roosevelt doesn't want European countries coming over here and meddling in Latin American affairs. In 1906, we've talked about Cuba a lot already. An independence movement is put down in Cuba, and the Americans are going to help do that. And in 1911, this is after Roosevelt has left office, troops and funds are going to support a shaky government in Nicaragua that is going to be friendly to the United States. So Roosevelt's corollary really gets put into action in the early 20th century. So we're going to spend a minute focusing on Panama, and this is something we're going to talk about quite a bit more in class and look at a few more images. But in 1903, Panama, which is right here, is a part of Colombia. In the United States, Roosevelt in particular, wanted to build a canal through Panama, and the Colombian government wouldn't allow them to do this. And so what ends up happening is the United States supports and helps organize an independence movement for Panama so that Panama can become independent. In exchange, they're given the rights to build a canal in Panama. So what we're going to be talking about is why they wanted to build this canal, how it would help the United States, and whether or not what they did was right or proper. And we'll also look at quite a few pictures of the canal during its building. So we're going to end this lesson by talking about the president who comes after Theodore Roosevelt, and that's William Howard Taft. And William Howard Taft was elected in 1908, and he was actually a hand-picked successor. Roosevelt wanted him to come next. And Taft really does continue what Roosevelt started with the Roosevelt corollary, but he also believed in something called dollar diplomacy. And basically his philosophy was we could substitute dollars for bullets at times, and we can use economic incentives or economic punishments to try and get other countries to do what the United States wanted them to do. That being said, military force was still sometimes used. So you see the United States doing a variety of different things to try and influence other parts of the world, and it's our job to try to evaluate them and determine when they were justified and when they weren't, what the motivations were, and perhaps compare them to different actions that the United States takes in other parts of the world today.